At 2:17 in the morning, Anthony Smith checked into a hotel he technically owned, a place he had built from contracts, risk, and a lifetime of learning how to stay in control. But control is a fragile thing when the past decides to walk back into your life uninvited. And just minutes after stepping into that quiet, polished hallway, something shifted, something he couldn't explain yet, because what he was about to see didn't belong in that world, and it certainly didn't belong to him anymore. But what he saw minutes later stopped him cold, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from confusion but from recognition. Because there are moments in life where your body understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. And as he turned the corner, his footsteps slowed without permission, his breath catching just slightly, as the polished floor reflected a scene that felt out of place in a building designed to look perfect at every hour of the night. A pregnant woman on her knees scrubbing the floor, moving slowly, carefully, like every motion carried weight beyond the child she was carrying, her shoulders tense, her posture tired in a way that didn't come from a long shift, but from something deeper, something that had been wearing her down for far longer than a single night. And there was something about the silence around her that made it feel like she had been doing this alone for a very long time. Exhausted, silent, invisible, the kind of invisible that doesn't happen by accident but by design, like someone had decided that she didn't need to be seen, didn't need to be noticed, didn't need to be asked if she was okay. And Anthony stood there longer than he should have, watching in a way he couldn't quite justify, because something about her presence didn't match the version of reality he had built for himself over the years. And when she looked up, just briefly, just enough for the hallway light to catch her face, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, devastating way that settles into your chest before you can push it away, because recognition isn't always immediate. Sometimes it creeps in through details, through memory, through something as small as the way someone holds their breath before they speak. He recognized her, and that realization didn't come with clarity at first. It came with resistance, because the version of her that existed in his memory didn't belong in a place like this, didn't belong on her knees in the middle of the night, didn't belong looking like she had been carrying more than anyone should have to carry alone. And yet there she was, real, present, and impossible to ignore. Not from the hotel, not from business, not from anything connected to the life he had built, but from somewhere much further back, somewhere he had spent years trying to outgrow, trying to leave behind without ever truly confronting. Because some people don't fade away, they just wait quietly in the corners of your memory until something forces you to see them again. From a life he buried 20 years ago, a life that didn't include wealth or control or carefully structured decisions, a life where things were simpler but also more uncertain, where loyalty meant something different, where promises were made without understanding how hard they would be to keep, and where one person in particular had mattered more than he ever admitted out loud. The problem wasn't just who she was, because recognition alone doesn't shake a man who has spent years building himself into something untouchable. The real problem was everything that recognition brought back with it, every unanswered question, every moment he chose not to look back, every reason he had convinced himself that leaving the past behind was the same as moving forward. It was what had happened to her, and who was responsible, because people don't end up like that overnight. They don't lose themselves in silence without a series of moments pushing them there. And as Anthony stood in that hallway, watching someone he once knew become someone he barely recognized, one thought settled in with a weight he couldn't ignore anymore, that whatever had brought her here wasn't over yet. Because by the time he understood the truth, by the time the pieces started to fall into place and the past stopped feeling like something distant and started feeling like something unfinished, it was already too late to walk away, too late to pretend this was just another moment in a long line of things that didn't concern him, too late to convince himself that he could turn around and go back to the version of his life where none of this existed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the hours that followed that moment in the hallway, Anthony Smith did what he had trained himself to do his entire life. He observed, he analyzed, and he kept his distance, because control had always been his advantage, the one thing that separated him from the uncertainty he grew up in. But this time control felt different. It felt incomplete. Because no matter how much he tried to reduce what he had just seen into something simple, something explainable, It refused to fit into anything. That made sense. How did she end up here, in a place like this, working a job that barely allowed her to stand upright, let alone carry the weight she was clearly struggling with? Because the version of her he remembered had always found a way to endure, but never like this, never quietly, never without pushing back against whatever tried to break her down. And yet now she moved carefully, almost cautiously, like someone who had learned the cost of being noticed. And then there was the question he couldn't ignore no matter how much he tried to stay rational. Who got her pregnant? Because that wasn't just a detail. It was a timeline. It was a story. It was proof that her life had continued in ways he knew nothing about. And something about that realization didn't sit right with him, not because of what it meant, but because of what it didn't explain: the exhaustion, the silence, the way she avoided even the smallest moment of connection. But the question that stayed with him the longest, the one that refused to settle into the background, was far simpler and far more unsettling at the same time. Why didn't she recognize him? Or if she did, why did she pretend she didn't? Because recognition is not something you can easily hide, especially not from someone who once knew you well enough to read the smallest changes in your expression. And yet when their eyes met, there had been nothing, no pause, no shift, just distance. Anthony Smith wasn't a man who believed in coincidence. Not anymore. Not after everything it had taken to build a life where outcomes were calculated and risks were managed. And as he replayed the moment over and over again in his mind, one thing became clear in a way that left no room for doubt. She acted like a stranger, but nothing about this felt like coincidence. Not the timing, not the place, and certainly not the way it all unfolded so quietly. He started paying attention in ways no one around him noticed, watching the patterns of the hotel as if it were something unfamiliar, noticing the small things most people ignored, the cleaning cart left in the same corner longer than necessary, the way certain staff members avoided specific hallways, the brief glimpse of her wrist when her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal marks that didn't belong to someone simply working too hard, marks that suggested something far more controlled, far more deliberate. And then there were the cameras, silent witnesses to everything that happened within those walls, offering angles that removed emotion and replaced it with fact, showing her movements across different floors, the times she worked, the moments she paused, and the strange gaps that didn't align with any standard schedule, gaps that raised more questions the longer he looked at them, because they suggested that parts of her time there were unaccounted for. What unsettled him most wasn't just what he was seeing. It was how quickly the pieces began to form a pattern, one that didn't look like bad luck or poor decisions, but something structured, something intentional. And for the first time in a long time, Anthony felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: uncertainty, not about what he was capable of doing, but about what he was about to uncover. And what Anthony Smith discovered over the next 48 hours would force him to confront a past he thought he'd escaped, not as a memory he could control or reshape, but as something still alive, still unresolved, and far more connected to the present than he had ever been willing to admit. To understand why that moment in the hallway mattered as much as it did, you have to go back to a time before Anthony Smith became the kind of man who could walk into a building he owned and expect everything inside it to follow a system. A time when control wasn't something he had mastered yet, but something he was still learning to chase, because he didn't grow up surrounded by stability. He grew up in a place where uncertainty was constant and where the smallest mistake could cost you more than you could afford to lose. Anthony Smith grew up poor, not in the kind of way people talk about lightly, but in the kind of way that teaches you early on that nothing is guaranteed, that every opportunity has to be earned, and that relying on anyone else is a risk you can't always take. And it was in that environment that he developed the instincts that would later define him: the need to stay alert, the habit of reading people quickly, and the quiet understanding that if you wanted something to last, you had to build it yourself. He wasn't the loudest or the most aggressive, but he was observant, the kind of person who noticed things others missed, and that awareness shaped him into someone who didn't just react to situations but anticipated them. Someone who learned how to step in before things got worse, especially when it came to people who couldn't defend themselves. And that part of him, the part that couldn't ignore someone else's struggle, showed up early in ways that would stay with him long after everything else had changed. Over time, those instincts evolved into discipline, and that discipline became the foundation of everything he built. From the first small risks he took to the larger decisions that eventually turned him into a self-made millionaire, someone who understood systems, who trusted structure, and who believed that control wasn't just an advantage but a necessity, because without it, everything could fall apart faster than it came together. But control came with a cost, and one of those costs was distance, the kind that separates you from anything that reminds you of where you started. And for Anthony Smith, the past wasn't something he revisited. It was something he left behind intentionally, not out of anger or regret, but out of necessity, because looking back too often made it harder to keep moving forward, and forward was the only direction he allowed himself to focus on. Anthony didn't lose people. He outgrew them. And for years, that belief held up. It justified the silence, the distance, the unanswered questions, because it framed everything as progress instead of loss. And as long as he kept moving, as long as he kept building, there was no reason to question whether something important had been left behind along the way. But long before the wealth, before the structure, before the version of himself that existed in that hotel hallway, there was someone who had known him before all of it, someone who had seen him without the control, without the distance, someone who existed in a version of his life that was far less certain, but far more real, and her name was Sarah Miller. Sarah Miller had never been the kind of person who demanded attention. She didn't need to, because there was something about her presence that stood out in quieter ways. The way she carried herself, the way she endured things without making them visible. And even as a child, there was a resilience in her that didn't come from strength alone, but from necessity. Because she had learned early on that the world didn't always make room for people like her. She was often overlooked, sometimes targeted, the kind of person other kids found easy to push around. Not because she was weak, but because she didn't fight back in the ways they expected. And that's where Anthony came in, not as a hero in the way stories usually describe, but as someone who simply refused to ignore what was happening, someone who stepped in without making it a spectacle, who stood between her and whatever tried to break her down. Their connection wasn't built on grand moments or dramatic declarations. It was built on small, consistent acts, the kind that don't seem significant at the time, but become impossible to replace later. Walking the same route home, sharing silence when words weren't necessary, understanding each other in ways that didn't require explanation, and over time, that quiet connection became something neither of them questioned, something that simply existed as part of who they were. One moment, in particular, stayed with him longer than most, a day that should have been ordinary, but became something else entirely, when a simple mistake turned into something painful, when a broken fence and a misjudged step sent Sarah falling forward, her face hitting the ground hard enough to leave a mark, and for a brief second, everything stopped, not because of the fall itself, but because of what came after. There was blood, more than he expected, running down her face, and for the first time, Anthony didn't know what to do, the situation slipping outside the boundaries of what he could control, and as he stood there, overwhelmed by something he couldn't fix immediately, she did something that didn't match the moment at all. She looked at him, wiped the blood away with the back of her hand, and told him not to cry, even though she was the one who was hurt. She told him not to cry, even when she was bleeding. And that moment stayed with him, not because of the injury, but because of what it revealed about her, about the way she handled pain, about the way she protected others even when she needed protection herself. And it was in moments like that that their bond was formed, not through words, but through understanding. But connections like that don't always get the ending they deserve. Sometimes they end quietly, without explanation, without closure, and that's exactly what happened, because one day, without warning, Sarah was gone, not gradually, not in a way that allowed for adjustment, but completely, as if she had been removed from his life without leaving a trace that made sense. There were no goodbyes, no clear reasons, just absence. And for a while, Anthony tried to make sense of it, tried to find answers that weren't there, but as time passed and nothing changed, he did what he had always done when faced with something he couldn't control. He moved forward, not because he understood, but because staying in that moment wouldn't change the outcome. He never found out what happened to her. And eventually, he stopped trying. And that decision, the choice to let the unanswered questions remain unanswered, became part of the foundation he built his future on, a future that didn't include her, a future that made sense without needing to look back. at least until the night everything he thought he had left behind found its way back into his life in the most unexpected way possible. By the time Anthony Smith returned to that same hallway later that night, the building had settled into the kind of silence that only exists in the early hours, when everything looks calm but feels slightly off, when even the smallest sound carries further than it should. And as he walked through the hotel he owned, something about the space felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed physically, but because now he was paying attention to things he had never needed to notice before. The night shift had always been routine, predictable, a system that functioned without interruption. But that sense of predictability began to fade the moment he started noticing the gaps, the empty stretches of hallway that felt longer than usual, the faint echo of footsteps that didn't belong to him, and the subtle presence of movement just out of sight, like someone working quietly to remain unnoticed. And it didn't take long before he saw her again. She was further down the corridor this time, leaning slightly against the cleaning cart as if she needed the support more than she wanted to admit, her movements slower than before, each action measured, careful, as though she had learned to conserve energy wherever she could. And even from a distance, it was clear that this wasn't just exhaustion from a long shift. This was something deeper, something that had been building over time. As he moved closer, the details became harder to ignore. The way she paused longer than necessary between tasks, the way her hand briefly pressed against her lower back as if trying to ease discomfort she couldn't fully escape, and the way her breathing changed ever so slightly when she thought no one was paying attention, subtle signs that pointed to someone pushing beyond what their body should reasonably handle. She was clearly overworked, but more than that, she was carrying something she wasn't acknowledging, not openly, not in a way that invited concern. And when the fabric of her sleeve shifted just enough to reveal part of her wrist again, Anthony noticed what he hadn't fully allowed himself to process earlier, marks that weren't accidental, marks that suggested pressure, restraint, something that didn't belong in a place that was supposed to be controlled and secure. She adjusted her sleeve quickly, almost instinctively, as if she knew exactly what needed to stay hidden, and that single movement told him more than anything she could have said. Because people don't hide things they aren't aware of, and they don't move like that unless they've done it before, unless concealment has become second nature, part of a routine they follow without thinking. When she realized he was standing there, her reaction was immediate but contained, her posture straightening just enough to appear composed, her expression neutral in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. And when their eyes met again, there was still no recognition in the way she looked at him, or at least none that she was willing to show, just a quiet acknowledgement of his presence before she returned to her work. Anthony didn't speak right away, not because he didn't have questions, but because he was watching, measuring, trying to understand what was real and what was being presented to him. And when he finally did ask if she was okay, her response came quickly, too quickly, a simple answer delivered without hesitation, the kind people give when they don't want a conversation to continue. She downplayed everything, the fatigue, the strain, even the visible signs that something wasn't right. And when he asked about her schedule, about how long she had been working, her answers were consistent but slightly off, just enough to suggest that she was telling a version of the truth rather than the whole of it. And it became clear that whatever she was dealing with, she wasn't going to admit it easily. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, where it seemed like she might say something more, where her expression shifted just slightly, like a thought had crossed her mind that she hadn't fully decided what to do with yet. But just as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared, replaced by that same controlled distance she had maintained from the beginning. Anthony had seen enough people in enough situations to recognize the pattern, the hesitation, the subtle inconsistencies, the way someone navigates a conversation when they are trying to avoid certain truths. And as he stood there, watching her return to her work as if nothing had happened, one thought settled into place with a clarity he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just someone having a hard time. This was someone being controlled. And once that idea formed, everything else began to align around it. The injuries, the silence, the way she moved, the way she spoke, all of it pointing towards something structured, something that extended beyond a difficult job or a bad situation. He didn't push further in that moment. Not because he wasn't concerned, but because he understood that forcing answers rarely leads to the truth. And as he stepped back, allowing her to continue without interruption, His focus shifted from observation to action, because if what he suspected was true, then the answers weren't going to come from her, at least not yet. And then Anthony checked the staff records, expecting to find something simple, something that would either confirm or dismiss his concerns, but what he found didn't make sense, not in a way that could be easily explained, not in a way that aligned with the version of reality the hotel was supposed to operate under. And for the first time since that night began, the situation moved from uncertain to something far more serious. The moment Anthony Smith stepped into his office and pulled up the internal staff system, the situation shifted from something personal to something that required precision, because whatever he had seen in that hallway was no longer just a memory resurfacing. It was a problem that existed within a structure he controlled, and if there was one thing he trusted, it was the ability to find answers when the system was forced to reveal them. At first glance, everything appeared normal, her name listed among the night staff, her position assigned, her schedule documented in a way that matched the surface-level expectations of a functioning operation. But Anthony had built his success on understanding that what looks correct isn't always true, and it didn't take long before the details began to separate from the pattern they were supposed to follow. The employment records didn't align the way they should have, small inconsistencies appearing in places most people would overlook, timestamps that didn't match actual shift logs, onboarding information that felt incomplete, and signatures that lacked the usual verification markers. Not enough to raise alarms for someone casually reviewing the system, but enough for someone like Anthony to recognize that something had been adjusted, altered just enough to pass unnoticed. Then there was the absence of information that should have been there, the kind of details every employee is required to provide: emergency contacts, personal references, basic identifiers that create accountability. And yet her file carried none of it in a complete or reliable form, as if the system had been intentionally left unfinished, or worse, deliberately restricted. The payment records only deepened the concern, because while her hours were logged, the compensation tied to those hours didn't follow the expected path. Transfers routed through accounts that didn't match standard payroll procedures, amounts that fluctuated without explanation, and intervals that suggested control rather than consistency, like someone else was deciding when and how she was paid, rather than the structure itself. At that point, Anthony understood that this wasn't an isolated issue, because systems don't fail in such specific ways without human involvement, and that realization shifted his focus outward, toward the people responsible for maintaining the environment he had trusted to operate without question. The hotel manager was the first to draw attention, not because of anything obvious, but because of what wasn't said, the hesitation in responses, the slight delay before answering direct questions, and the way his composure seemed just a fraction too controlled, as though he was choosing his words carefully rather than speaking from routine knowledge. And while none of it confirmed anything, it added to a growing sense that something within the structure was being managed differently than it should have been. The staff offered little clarity, their answers brief, their interactions limited, and when asked about her specifically, there was a pattern that became impossible to ignore: avoidance, not overt refusal, but subtle redirection, like they had learned that certain topics were better left untouched, and whether that came from instruction or instinct, it suggested awareness, even if no one was willing to say it outright. Then there were the cameras, the one element Anthony had always relied on for objective truth, because footage doesn't hesitate, it doesn't reinterpret, it simply records what happens. But even that certainty began to fracture as he reviewed the timelines, because while most of her movements were documented, there were gaps, periods where the footage cut out or failed to capture anything at all. Not random enough to be dismissed as technical failure, but not consistent enough to be immediately explained. The pattern was becoming clearer, not through a single piece of evidence, but through accumulation, small details aligning in a way that pointed towards something controlled, something maintained over time. And as Anthony moved through the hotel again later that day, the environment felt different, no longer just a space he owned, but a space that had been operating under conditions he hadn't fully understood. It was during one of those moments, in a quiet section of the building where the day staff had not yet filled the space, that he saw her again, and this time, the strain she had been carrying was no longer something she could conceal completely, because as she moved across the floor, her balance shifted unexpectedly, her hand reaching out instinctively for support that wasn't there. and for a brief second, she faltered. It wasn't dramatic, not enough to draw attention from anyone else, but enough for Anthony to see it clearly. The moment her body gave way just slightly under the weight it had been holding, and without thinking, he stepped forward, closing the distance before she could recover on her own. But as quickly as he reached her, she pulled back, regaining her posture with a kind of urgency that didn't match the situation. She refused help, not aggressively, not in a way that created conflict, but firmly, her voice steady despite everything suggesting it shouldn't be. And in that refusal, there was something more than independence. There was caution, like accepting assistance carried a risk she wasn't willing to take, even when it was clearly needed. Anthony didn't push her in that moment, but the image stayed with him, reinforcing what the records had already begun to suggest. And as he stepped away, allowing her to continue as if nothing had happened, the conclusion that had been forming quietly in the background became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just working there. She was being kept there, and once that thought settled into place, everything else shifted, because employment implies choice. It implies freedom to leave, to speak, to exist without constant restriction, and nothing about her behavior, her records, or the environment surrounding her supported that idea. The next step wasn't about confirmation anymore. It was about understanding who was responsible, because control like that doesn't exist without someone enforcing it. And it didn't take long before a name began to surface, not through official channels, but through indirect references, fragments of conversation, and patterns that pointed toward a single individual connected to her presence in the hotel. He wasn't listed as staff, didn't appear in any formal capacity, but he was there, consistently enough to matter, someone who had access without explanation, whose presence aligned too closely with the gaps in her schedule and the irregularities in her records. And the more Anthony observed, the clearer it became that this man's role extended beyond something casual or coincidental. Whether he was a boyfriend, a handler, or something more controlling, the distinction mattered less than the pattern he represented, because his influence was visible in the way she carried herself, in the way she avoided certain interactions, in the way her situation seemed structured around limitations rather than choices. And for the first time since this began, Anthony found himself facing a reality that required more than observation. But the real question wasn't who he was. It was why Sarah hadn't asked for help. Because if the situation was as controlled as it appeared, then silence wasn't just a condition, it was a decision, and understanding that decision would reveal far more than anything else he had uncovered so far. By the time Anthony Smith decided to stop observing and finally confront what had been building between them, the situation had already crossed a line that could no longer be ignored, because patterns only remain patterns until someone forces them into the open. And he understood that whatever truth Sarah Miller had been avoiding was not going to reveal itself through distance or quiet analysis. It required a moment where silence could no longer hold. He chose a time when the hotel was at its quietest again, not by coincidence, but because he knew that privacy mattered, not just for him, but for her, because whatever she had been carrying, it wasn't something she was willing to expose in front of others. And when he found her alone, away from the cameras that seemed to miss too much and the staff who said too little, the space between them felt heavier than it had before, filled with everything that had gone unspoken for years. This time, he didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't follow the careful approach he had maintained up until that point, because there was nothing careful left to preserve. And when he said her name, not the one on the records, but the one that belonged to the life they once shared, something shifted in a way that couldn't be hidden, not fully. Not anymore. For a brief moment, she didn't move, didn't respond, and that silence said more than anything else could have, because recognition doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes with stillness, with the inability to maintain the version of yourself you've been presenting. And when she finally looked at him, really looked this time, the distance that had been there before wasn't the same. She had recognized him from the beginning, and that realization didn't come as a relief. It came as something far more complicated, because it meant every interaction, every avoided glance, every carefully measured response had been intentional, not the result of confusion or detachment, but a decision, one she had made long before he ever stepped into that hallway. The question wasn't whether she knew who he was, it was why she chose to act like she didn't. And as the silence stretched just long enough to make the weight of that truth settle between them, The answer began to take shape in ways he hadn't fully expected, because silence like that doesn't exist without reason, and whatever that reason was, it had been strong enough to keep her from reaching out, even when the opportunity had been right in front of her. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with hesitation, it wasn't fragile or uncertain. It was controlled, direct, and carried a weight that didn't come from the present alone, but from everything that had led up to it, everything that had remained unresolved for far too long. You don't get to come back now, not after disappearing when I needed you. The words landed without exaggeration, without raised voices or visible anger, but their impact was undeniable, because they reframed everything Anthony thought he understood about the situation, shifting it from something external, something he could fix by identifying the right problem, to something internal, something that had been shaped by choices he had made years ago without fully understanding their consequences. In that moment, the distance between them wasn't just physical, it was time, it was memory, it was every unanswered question that had been left behind when she disappeared. And for the first time, Anthony wasn't looking at a situation he could control, he was looking at the result of a past he had chosen not to confront. The truth came slowly after that, not as a single revelation, but as a series of pieces that fit together with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore, because once the silence was broken, there was no reason left to maintain the version of the story that had kept everything contained. Her life after leaving hadn't followed any clear path. It hadn't been shaped by opportunity or stability, but by survival, by decisions made under pressure, by circumstances that didn't offer many options. And over time, those circumstances became patterns, and those patterns became the structure of a life that looked nothing like the one she might have had if things had been different. There had been moments where she tried to regain control, moments where she moved forward, where things seemed like they might stabilize, but each time, something shifted, something pulled her back into situations that were harder to leave than they were to enter, and eventually, those situations became normal, not because they were acceptable, but because they were consistent. The man Anthony had begun to notice wasn't just part of her life, he was central to it, not in the way relationships are supposed to function, but in a way that limited her choices, that controlled access to money, to movement, to even the smallest decisions, and over time, that control became something she navigated carefully rather than something she openly resisted, because resistance carried consequences she had already learned too well. The pregnancy wasn't something she spoke about directly at first, but it existed in every pause, every careful movement, every moment where she chose her words with precision, and it added another layer to everything she was already dealing with, another reason to remain cautious, another factor that made leaving more complicated than it might have been otherwise. For Anthony, the realization didn't come with clarity, it came with conflict, because everything he was hearing, everything he was beginning to understand, connected back to a version of himself he had spent years distancing from, and the idea that his absence had played a role, even indirectly, in where she ended up was not something he could easily reconcile. There was guilt in that realization, not the kind that comes from a single mistake, but the kind that builds from accumulated choices, from moments where action might have changed something, even if the outcome wasn't guaranteed, and alongside that guilt was something else, something sharper, something directed outward rather than inward. Anger, not just at the situation, but at the structure that allowed it to exist, at the presence of someone who had taken advantage of vulnerability and turned it into control. And for the first time since this began, the situation shifted again, not just from observation to understanding, but from understanding to intent. Because knowing the truth changes the nature of the decision that follows. And as Anthony stood there, facing not just the past but the reality of what Sarah's life had become, one thing became clear in a way that left no room for hesitation. Walking away was no longer an option, not now, not after everything that had been revealed, not when the cost of inaction was something he could no longer ignore. The final piece came quietly, not as a dramatic confession, but as something she allowed him to understand without fully saying it, because some truths don't need to be explained in detail to be clear. And as the reality of her situation settled into place, one fact became impossible to ignore. The pregnancy wasn't tied to anything hopeful. It wasn't the result of stability or choice. It was something she carried because she had been left without one. Anthony didn't react the way he might have years ago. There was no immediate anger, no reckless decision. because control had shaped him too deeply for that. But beneath that control, something shifted, something that wasn't driven by impulse but by certainty. Because this wasn't a situation that could be negotiated or ignored, it required action, not for the sake of resolution, but for the sake of protection. The man behind it all didn't expect to be confronted, not in a way that disrupted the pattern he had maintained, because control often depends on remaining unnoticed, on operating within spaces where no one asks the right questions. And when Anthony finally stepped into that space, it wasn't with uncertainty. It was with the kind of clarity that only comes when every piece of the situation has been understood. The confrontation didn't unfold in chaos. It unfolded with precision, because Anthony didn't rely on assumptions. He relied on proof, the records, the inconsistencies, the footage that had been overlooked, all of it forming a structure that couldn't be easily denied. And when it was finally brought into the open, the control that had once seemed unbreakable began to lose its hold. There were consequences, not immediate in appearance, but definitive in outcome, because systems, when forced to respond, don't hesitate the way individuals do. And as the situation moved beyond private control into something that required accountability, the balance shifted in a way that made it clear this wasn't something that could continue as it had before. For Sarah, the change wasn't immediate relief. It wasn't a sudden return to something stable or familiar, because experiences like that don't disappear when the structure around them is removed. But for the first time, there was space to make decisions without the same restrictions, space to exist without constant pressure shaping every choice. Anthony didn't try to rebuild what they once had, not in the way it existed before, because time had changed too much, and the distance between who they were and who they had become couldn't simply be erased. But what he did understand was that some things aren't about restoring the past. They're about ensuring the future doesn't repeat it. He stayed, not as someone trying to reclaim something lost, but as someone who understood the weight of what had happened and the responsibility that came with knowing it. And in that decision, there was no expectation of forgiveness, no assumption that things would return to what they were, only the understanding that walking away again would carry a cost he was no longer willing to accept. Some people spend their lives building wealth, only to realize too late what they should have protected. And for Anthony Smith, that realization didn't come as a lesson learned in hindsight. It came as a decision made in the present, one that would define everything that followed, not in terms of what he gained, but in terms of what he chose not to lose again. If you were in his position, would you have stepped in or walked away? What stays with people long after a story like this ends isn't just what happened, but the questions it leaves behind, the kind that don't settle easily. Because even with everything revealed, there are still parts of Sarah Miller's silence that can't be fully explained by circumstance alone. And that's where the story shifts from something you watch to something you reflect on. What do you think really kept her there for so long? Was it fear, the kind that builds quietly over time until it feels normal? Or was it something deeper, something tied to the past, to trust that had been broken long before Anthony Smith ever walked back into her life? Because sometimes the hardest situations to leave aren't the ones that look the most dangerous from the outside. They're the ones that reshape how a person sees their own options. Subscribe if you want more real stories like this, stories that don't just present what happened, but ask why it happened and what could have been different, because the difference between walking away and stepping in isn't always as clear as it seems, and sometimes it's only in hindsight that people realize which choice truly mattered.